This has been a tumultuous week across our nation, to say the least. And long-standing voices of injustice and pain and hurt are woven together with fear and with anger and violence, caught in a web of corruption, agenda-driven politics, and a divided nation, all amplified by this viral pandemic and quarantining that has preoccupied our lives for the past 3 months. I want to begin this message by asking for your grace as I speak about these events today. I feel compelled to speak. I must speak as a community leader, but I feel unprepared to do so. Not because I haven't put in the time or the effort, and not because I don't have feelings and opinions and passion, but more because I'm not sure which words to say. So I just need to speak. I need to be honest. I need to be vulnerable with you today, and to help us all to keep our eyes and hearts and actions focused on the love and the works that God is doing in our world today. There are a few reasons why I feel unprepared. I personally feel so many competing emotions. I've seen so many traumatizing videos, and I have not yet processed these feelings. I've researched and heard so many different perspectives and angles on what's happening that people feel passionate about. And I'm not prepared to talk to you today about current events from a political angle. That's not my expertise. I don't claim to know, and I don't even want to speculate right now about which political groups are doing what and why, which narratives are more or less true. We have a diverse community here with diverse opinions and political perspectives, different personal experiences and backgrounds, and that's okay. You each need to do your honest work to come to these conclusions as best as you can. I also don't feel equipped to speak to you now about the complex and cyclical issues that surround deep-seated roots of racism and often unspoken social prejudice, social inequality, class, and the anger and rage and hurt that so often follow, except just to say, I hear this cry. And yet this week, I have become more aware that I feel isolated from the pain that the nation is going through. Like so many of us watching from afar. I have watched the heart-wrenching videos of George Floyd's death a number of times from the distance of my computer and my phone. I heard his muffled cries for help and the pleading of passers-by while his arresting officer seemed to coolly mock him, even lean his weight deeper into his neck. And I watched what looked like officers stand callously by as he fell silent. And I sensed intimidation by other officers and passers-by whose souls seemed to cringe at what they were seeing. But they were not able or didn't know how or were afraid to move to action. And you'd think that once he was unconscious and the officer found no pulse that he would have done CPR or something, but he seemed to press in, even placing his hand in his pocket. I don't know what his motivations were. I can't say. Was he motivated by explicit racial hate? Was he acting out of deep-seated social and racial prejudice? Did he just not care? Charges have been made. The courts will decide. I've talked with my sons and daughters about how to respond well to authority, both just authority and unjust authority. And yes, though I have been sheltered from this my life, as a Jew and as a Messianic Jew, I am keenly aware of the oppression our people have faced throughout history, and that we and my children may yet face again in the days to come. And as anti-Semitism seems to rise, the Jewish and black communities have this in common. Prejudice is prejudice. Hate is hate. But that said, personally, I have not even had to think that my children might see me abused by those in authority here in America who are supposed to be our protectors because of my skin. Yet, from what I hear from my black brothers and sisters out there, this is something that many feel the threat of every day. So to me, regardless of which narratives you're listening to, we still must ask what it's like to walk in each other's shoes, the shoes of the one who is crying out. I heard Pastor Chris Battle in Knoxville speak Floyd's last words, "I can't breathe." This time, Pastor Battle shouted, "I can't breathe," because of the racial prejudice he felt in Southern America. And I do believe that injustice for one is injustice for all. that is Yeshua's sentiment as well. And as I reflected on that video, I could hear George Floyd cry, I can't breathe. And I could also hear one of the officers ask to turn him over, to stop. And I could hear the people who had been passing by videotaping with their phones begin to beg the officer to stop. And I've asked myself, what would I have done? Would I have stood by and filmed? Would I have risked my own safety to push over the policeman where I would be arrested? Would I have called the other police? Or would I have been paralyzed by the disconnect? Someone who holds the authority to protest and uphold the law, breaking and abusing his criminal, and unsure what was actually happening. In hindsight, I hope I would act, but these are important questions for us to ask ourselves. What do we do when we see injustice? Do we speak out? Do we take a stand? Do we watch? Or do we turn the other way? And this becomes even more complex in national issues, where so often real injustice can become inseparable with a politically driven agenda. And then when we act, how do we act? I heard the angry shouts of mobs on video as fire was set to a police car. I saw Macy being robbed on camera. I saw rocks fly through windows. I listened to George Floyd's brother's impassioned cry to find a nonviolent way. He said, "You don't see me doing this, why are you?" I heard a black woman through tears scream at two white women dressed in black as they vandalized Starbucks, spray painting Black Lives Matter on the windows. This woman said, "Why are you doing this? We aren't doing this. You're hurting us." I heard a young woman over a live stream video scream in agony to the unnamed masses that her sister, who was her closest friend, was just shot by a rider shooting into the crowd and killed. She sobbed, "This wasn't the police, this was you." And I've also heard a black woman shout out at the real oppression and evil is the political sabotage and the exploitation of the black community's right to peacefully protest a real injustice, sowing seeds of destruction, violence, and hate in order to influence the upcoming election. Essentially throwing the black community under the bus. This black woman argued passionately that this was an even worse form of oppression. And I've also seen the disturbing videos of police violence, dragging people from cars. I saw the video of the police officers push over the 70-some-year-old elderly man who lay on the ground bleeding without help. I saw the video of Latoya Ratliff, who was shot in the head with a rubber bullet from a line of officers. She was peacefully protesting, from what I could see, not fighting or disrupting anything. And as she was bleeding on the street, none of the law enforcement left the line to go and help her. There's something wrong here. This should not be a war. This video made me cry. And I saw protesters give water and flowers to police officers, and police officers shaking hands and giving a knee in solidarity. And we think of the pain that so many of the police are going through right now. Officers who are good policemen who have been pelted with bricks and shot at and killed and rammed by drivers and vehicles. We think of David Doran, who was a 77-year-old black captain officer who was shot while he tried to stop looters. I was moved by a sign at his funeral that said, "You killed a black man because they killed a black man?" New York Times quoted Austin Police Chief, "I'm crushed. I've cried a few times today." And they also quoted a police supervisor saying, "We feel like we're pawns in a game right now. It's almost like there's an agenda and we're being used on both sides, the left and the right, to further that agenda." This is craziness. And it is so important that we do not lump people together in mass groups here or buy into only one narrative. It's just way more complicated. My message today is not one to give answers. It's not one to assign blame or to give one particular viewpoint. And I apologize if I've offended anybody. My message is just that we see all of it and that it needs to be spoken. And it's okay to be in the confusion of it and not fully understand. And it's okay to feel the tensions. These are tensions that Yeshua was familiar with. But the chaos is not the end of the story. And I want to close with some positive takeaways that I think can help us process, engage, and respond constructively. And these are not paintbrushes, to wipe away what's going on. But how do we interact with this? First, I think that we must treasure the sanctity of life. Treasure the sanctity of life. We must not become so caught up in our own lives, in our own context, that we're unable to enter meaningfully into other people's lives who are different from us. We must not be so caught up with an agenda or tangled with fear that we become calloused to how valuable each and every person is. The truth is that God created every human being in his image, and no matter what we've done or haven't done, he loves us as unique individuals with great value. And I know it's easy to say, all people are made in the image of God. I get it. And it's easy to use that as a sort of paintbrush to not deal with or address underlying social problems. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think that at the core of everything going on, whether it be deep-seated racism, police violence, politically driven violence, we must raise the value of human life in our eyes and see each other in all of our differences with God's eyes, as images of himself, temples within whom God's presence seeks to dwell. And I would go even further, that we need to practice seeing people with these eyes. The only way that you could take another life like this, or watch dispassionately, as these offers seem to, the only way you could do this is when you don't identify with that person. You don't see that person in your own context. Either they are too far removed for you to identify with their suffering, or fear or even unspoken prejudice cause you to see a person's life as less valuable than your own. In the video, the officer seemed to not even flinch when he felt that there was no pulse. Where does that come from? Could he have done this if he was able to see the image of God in this man? We don't need to wait for a crisis to practice this. The real work begins day to day, one-on-one, with your family, with your neighbors, and the people that God has put into your life. And then it carries over to those whom we might feel uncomfortable with. How do you respond to people when you're angry? How much respect and consideration and kindness do you share? It starts with looking inward at selfishness when we evaluate ourselves or elevate ourselves above others. And I think that might be why Yeshua says that even calling someone a fool is as if you've committed murder, because it's of the same root. And then this extends to the unnamed people we communicate with. What about those who post on social media? When we communicate with those masses, those we hear about in the news. We should be careful about desensitizing ourselves. For me, I find that I have to not watch violent movies with lots of killing for entertainment purposes. This is just me. Because what happens for me is weeks after the movie, I'm still imagining the families of the extras in the movie, who were killed, even though the main characters may have survived. So I worry about the dead clones in Star Wars, I don't think it's healthy to graphically see life taken again and again, even if it's only acting. And honestly, I feel that I have been desensitized. Watching a man die on a video on YouTube should be more shocking and more traumatizing to me than it was. And that bothers me. And I have to say, I don't feel like I'm broken enough by what's going on. Now, I don't mean that means we should take on the anxiety or the anger or the fear. But I'd like to take on more of God's love in my life. And I'm not asking you to feel guilty for not feeling grief every time you hear a bad news story. In the world we live in, we couldn't live if we did that. We're not meant to do that. But I'm asking that we try to become more aware. Human life is priceless and something we all need to learn how to treasure and to see in each other more and more, even in those who are different or in those of whom we might be afraid. Second, we all can work to raise our own awareness of prejudices and fears. I think that treasuring life after God's image is a root for goodness, but it needs to extend beyond whom we are comfortable with. Now, I don't think that it's right to accuse whole people groups of racial prejudice. I think that's wrong. But racism and other kinds of prejudice is a very real thing, and it takes on many forms and can be built into the systems that we have and become hidden motivators behind our choices. This is challenging to everyone. This takes a lot of work and introspection to see. We have to be willing to look at our fears and sometimes the uncomfortable feelings that we have in the face. I think that all people can benefit from doing this because we all have hidden prejudices that are motivated by the unknown, fear of one who is different, past experiences, past hurt, unforgiveness. And racial prejudice is not only limited to whites or blacks or any people group. That's what's going on now, and it's important, but it's a human problem. And I have benefited from taking the time to put this message together and really look at my own relationships with and feelings around those who are different from me, or those whom I know little about, or those for whom I have ingrained stereotypes that were written unconsciously in my mind from days or messaging that I can no longer even recall. So look into your soul to uncover any unspoken prejudices. Be aware, be intentional, and then find ways to bring God's greater truth into that. Thirdly, we should be wounded by the oppression of the strong over the weak. From the bully at school to entire communities, this is at Yeshua's heart. Right now, I find that I don't agree fully with everything I hear on media. There are so many different angles. I'm angered by some of it. I'm moved by parts of it. I don't know what to do with other parts of it, but I do hear a whole community crying out, and that is important. Our Messiah Yeshua has a special place in his heart for the underprivileged, the vulnerable among us, the orphan, the widow, the broken, the hurting, the oppressed. We think of his interaction with the woman at the well, a woman who was at the bottom of the bottom. Her community was rejected, and she was rejected by her community. She was one of the first people he told that he was the Messiah, and he loved her. Yeshua is one who was oppressed and excluded. Yeshua is one who was murdered. We should not be able to tolerate witnessing oppression. It should break our hearts, and our Messiah's righteousness should burn in our souls. And lastly, we must always keep God's larger plans in the front of our minds. It's easy to get caught up in what's going on in very unhealthy ways that drag us into the very things that cause the problems we're trying to correct. We have to keep the end of the story in mind and use the greater redemptive work that God is doing as a compass. We read about this in Mark today, the coming of the Son of Man, the one who will come on the clouds of heaven to make all things right in our broken world, the one who will bring true and lasting peace among all men and women of every nation, of every class, even with very creation itself. This must be our guiding compass. And to close, again, the last thing I want to do is sort of use a spiritual paintbrush to just brush over the real and poignant issues that are out there. These are real problems, and we need to make it right, and we need to do things to make it right, even little things. A small thing that I'm happy about, Rabbi Rich has already reached out to a pastor of a black church in downtown Boston to show that our congregation's solidarity and to build a new relationship. And they have a date on the calendar to get together in a few weeks. And, a small thing, but it's an important thing. And on top of that, and in addition to the other harder work that needs to be done that I've only hinted at, the ultimate answer is found in his love. A love that must run through our veins. A love that must run through our souls. A love that swallows prejudice. A love that dissolves our fears and our anger. A love that heals our hurts so that we cry his tears. So that we see the way that he sees. We hear what he hears and live with his kindness. We live with his nobility, with his honor, and in his faithfulness. I leave you with that today and a meaningful Shabbat Shalom.